The internet had been long censored and controlled under the martial law. And when the government allowed the internet to get into the country and made it accessible for citizens, and somehow with a lot of barriers, we knew that there is absolutely a surveillance system had been set up.
I watched the increasingly sophisticated way that Russia used multiple conflicting conspiracy theories around events such as the downing of MH17 and the Skripal poisoning.
In the following years, you started to see with elections, the 2016 election in Uganda, and then there were some other ones that followed. And you started to see they were trying to do things like block social media or shut the internet down.
2 to 3 regions where you see the highest levels of digital repression prevalence are Central Asia, the Middle East, and then also South Asia.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies special series on digital authoritarianism. Over the past few years, our institute has focused a lot of its efforts on looking at the rise of digital authoritarianism around the globe. And we want to look at its impact on human rights, especially in China, the Philippines, Russia, or Saudi Arabia. And this series, I want to say, could not have happened without the support of the U.S. Embassy in Ottawa and our colleagues at the U.S. Consulate here in Montreal. And we want to thank them for their support. We have already hosted 4 events as part of this series that seeks to shine light on how authoritarian leaders leverage technologies to crack down on civil rights and to commit human rights abuses. Today, in particular, we want to look at how some of the technologies used by authoritarian regimes in China or Russia and Saudi Arabia end up also being used and adopted by other governments, including in Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, or Eastern Europe. We also want to discuss how and what democracies and civil society and tech companies must or can do to stop the spread of digital authoritarianism. To discuss this, it's my great pleasure to welcome Stephen Feldstein, Jessica Brandt, Yinka Adoke, and Noura Al-Jizawi. I'm not going to go through their full bios because they're very long, but I'm going to ask them to, for 2 minutes or so, just briefly introduce themselves and talk about perhaps some of their research. Perhaps we're going to go with Jessica first. Jessica, welcome. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me today. It's a treat to be among this group and looking forward to all of your questions. I'm Jessica Brandt. I am the policy director for the AI and Emerging Technologies Initiative at the Brookings Institution, where I run a new project called the Global Forum for Democracy and Technology. And so we look at a wide range of issues that touch on democracy and technology at the nexus of those themes. So issues ranging from inequality to security implications of emerging technologies. My own work focuses on the information competition between democracies, liberal democracies in particular, and authoritarian challengers, Russia and China in particular, and how democracies can push back. So I hope that's a subject that we'll have a chance to dive into as we go through the conversation today, and really looking forward again to your questions and insights too. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Yinka, do you want to go next, perhaps?
Yes, thank you for having me, Mary. My name is Yinka Adegoke. I am the editor for strategic initiatives at Rest of World. Rest of World is a publication which covers the impact of technology around the world, and this subject is very much in our ballpark. It's one that we have covered on everything from misinformation to the spread of the 2 internet shutdowns and all these related subjects. Before this, I was the editor of Quartz Africa, where again, this is perhaps where I first came into contact with this subject, and unlike many of the speakers who do all the original research, which I've probably reported about several times, for myself as a journalist and for other journalists, this area is one in which we're very interested in, because we have a self-interest, both in terms of the stories about what governments are doing, but also because it affects the way our own what we believe is fair and accurate information is distributed, and how it gets manipulated on some of these platforms and with these technologies, and frankly just gets blocked from people. So this is a subject in which we are, as journalists, we almost, you could say, we have a bias. Because we have a bias towards spreading accurate information, and I look forward to hearing about the research from some of my fellow speakers, but also sharing with you some of the things that we've seen over the last few years.
Nora, do you want to go next? And then we'll go to Steve.
Thanks so much for having me. It's my great pleasure to be here today. My name is Noura Jizawi. I'm a research officer with Citizen Lab at University of Toronto. As you know, Citizen Lab studies the targeted digital threats and on journalists and human rights defenders worldwide. Currently, I'm working on multiple projects, including this is the biggest project is about the digital transnational repression and targeting the dissidents and the human rights defenders here in Canada.
Thank you. Steve, last but not least.
Great, thank you as well for having me. I really appreciate being on the panel with the others. My name is Steve Feldstein. I'm a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I'm based in the Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program, where I focus on issues linked to democracy, digital technology, and politics. So in my research, I've looked extensively at different trends and patterns related to digital repression, and published a book earlier this year, The Rise of Digital Repression, which specifically tries to look at different factors and reasons for why governments are using certain technologies, whether it's surveillance, censorship techniques, internet shutdowns, disinformation, or otherwise, as linked to their political strategies. As part of the book, and just in terms of my prior work, I've done a lot of field research in countries like Ethiopia, the Philippines, and Thailand, as well as Hong Kong, to really kind of get a ground level experience and to understand insights from local activists, politicians, company representatives, government officials about how these different trends are coming together. Broadly, I have a background both in terms of research as well as extensive government service, and spent significant portions of my career working at the State Department, the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, as well as USAID. I look forward to the discussion. Thanks again for having me.
As I mentioned in introduction, Migs has been focusing on this subject for the past year and a half or 2 years. Looking at your own experience, when did you start noticing a trend in the use of technology to repress human rights in authoritarian countries such as China, Saudi Arabia, and then when did you start seeing spread into other countries? Feel free to just step in when you want to answer. But I know, Steve, your book focuses a lot on this, and when you decided to write it. Sure,
I'm happy just to kind of cue off of that, just my own personal experience. I mean, for me, it was really my last job in government. I was working as in the Democracy Human Rights Bureau at the State Department, and I was really focused on sub-Saharan Africa in particular, and thinking kind of broadly about human rights violations taking place and different methods that governments were using. And what was really interesting to me is I increasingly saw both how dissidents, opposition movements were organizing online and using different platforms, Facebook and Twitter, as a way to mobilize their followers, but also how governments were recognizing that this was increasingly becoming a challenge to their role and were seeking tools to push back. And a large part of the default tools, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, have been pretty blunt instruments like internet shutdowns. But I also saw targeted persecution against digital influencers and people who are viewed as having particularly large followings. And then you started seeing also the influence of different surveillance techniques, censorship, selective blocking of websites, and so forth. And so I became increasingly concerned and troubled by what seemed to be this kind of movement away just from using physical tactics, mass arrests, charging people in courts, to much more of this kind of these digital techniques. And that's kind of, for me, was the entry point into trying to understand better, the role of dissent, challenges in the internet, and how that was all playing out in new ways around the world.
My experience is actually from hands-on experience. I'm originally from Syria. In Syria, we knew that the fact that the internet is being surveilled since we had the internet, more precisely, activists and citizens more generally knew that all communication, including the internet, had been long censored and controlled under the martial law. And when the government allowed the internet to get into the country and made it accessible for citizens, and somehow with a lot of barriers, we knew that there is absolutely a surveillance system had been set up. But then after a couple of years, when it was becoming a fact, and the proof was the mass detention campaigns targeted human rights defenders, activists, journalists, and bloggers in relation to their online activities, including myself. So it was this happened between 2004 and 2006. And some of them until now are still detained. And since then, definitely the Syrian government and the other, following the steps of other authoritarian regimes in the region, were working so hard seeking any kind of more sophisticated technologies to repress and to control the internet.
For me, it was maybe just shy of a decade ago that I was at the Brookings Institution tracking Russia issues, and I watched the increasingly sophisticated way that Russia used multiple conflicting conspiracy theories around events such as the downing of MH17 and the Skripal poisoning to really flood the zone and to sort of create the impression that the truth is unknowable and to crowd out the truth. And so that was a real wake-up call for me about the use of these tools in great power competition. And it really sparked the research that I do now.
For me, it was in telling stories, in reporting stories, and the first strange conversation that I had about this issue was actually talking to a government official in Nigeria at the peak of the Boko Haram when they kidnapped the schoolgirls, and the whole world was up in arms, and one of the regulators that I spoke to said, well, the thing we need to do next is we need to know what people are saying on WhatsApp, and we need to be able to read what people are saying. And that was kind of the first red flag, as they say, that governments were thinking about this. And then as in the following years, you started to see with elections, the 2016 election in Uganda, and then there were some other ones that followed, and you started to see they were trying to do things like block social media or shut the internet down. Because I cover Africa mostly, that has been a trend which I'm sure we'll get into more, that has just sort of grown over the last few years.
In terms of, digital tools are seen by authoritarian leaders as a way to achieve kind of pre-existing or existing repressive goals. What kind of regional variations have you noticed? Is it just a question of, how are they adopting different tactics? Is it just a question of access to the technology, a question of money? Obviously, some countries are a lot more low tech than others. Perhaps Steve, you've looked at different regions, Yinka as well. You've looked at Uganda or Ethiopia.
Yeah, sure. Just in terms of kind of the broader trends, what I've seen regionally. So one thing that's kind of worth noting, and I think, Marie, you said it well in terms of kind of the linkage between pre-existing repression and digital tools, is that the two to three regions that where you see the highest levels of digital repression prevalence are Central Asia, the Middle East, and then also South Asia. Those are all three areas where there's enhanced levels across the board of surveillance, censorship tools, and so on. And it also happens to be that this is where you see clustered the greatest number of authoritarian regimes as well. Conversely, where you see kind of the lowest prevalence levels are Europe and North and South America, where you also have a greater level of sort of democratic governments in play. And so that kind of just gives kind of one insight that there is such a strong relationship in terms of regime type and the type of political systems that people live in, and the types of tools then that they may or may not be subjected to. The other point, just to kind of quickly mention as well, is that there does seem to be a bit of regional copycat behavior that you see. And so often when certain types of tools are used, internet shutdowns is a great case in point in sub-Saharan Africa, you see lots of other governments sort of emulating that behavior, particularly when it comes to things like political events like elections, or in conjunction with armed operations or so forth. And so there does seem to be a bit of this kind of imitation and watching and learning, especially on a regional basis, when it comes to using different techniques and how that then proliferates and expands throughout these geographic areas.
Yeah, I love that point that Steve just made, because that is exactly the way it played out in sub-Saharan Africa. As you started to see, like I mentioned earlier, Uganda in 2016, then you had Cameroon had their issues with separatists or supposed separatists, and they shut down the internet in a certain section of the country, the English-speaking section of the country for about 230 days. But you've seen it just sort of spread across the continent. Ethiopia has had shutdowns multiple times, and is currently going through one in Tigray, in the Tigray region. Chad had the internet off for nearly a year and has had many shutdowns since then. There's just been this, to that point about authoritarian governments, and sort of the organizations that measure the strength of your democracy often has many, even democratically elected governments in Africa are sort of low on the list of how strong their democracies are. You could see that many of the countries are just getting more and more concerned about the fact, or I should say the governments are getting more and more concerned about the fact that they are unable to control the flow of information, tell people what they want them to hear. And they're trying a lot of different techniques. There has been the internet shutdowns, but then they've also moved into trying to block specific apps. Obviously, Facebook being a key one, but also Twitter and WhatsApp, where a lot of organizers sort of share information. So we're definitely seeing more of a trend in this direction. And it's interesting to me that, as someone who grew up many years ago when there were actually military governments in power, what's interesting to me is that there's also a link to this sort of these democratic events, specifically elections. Like it's almost as if there's a concern that yes, people can vote for whoever they supposedly want, but we have to have some control as to how this happens, and we will use these tools to control that.
I'm happy to chime in just to maybe point out that when we think about some of the major sort of actors in this space, Russia and China, I think, it's important to acknowledge variation, at least between those two parties. So Russia is, I think, by many measures, a declining power that sort of pursues interference activity in order to compensate for its relative weakness. It has little to gain, or little to lose, I should say, from sort of being exposed for some of its interference activities. And so it's considerably less risk averse. It's sort of, playing a near-term game. It's trying to disrupt the alliances and institutions and democratic processes, in competitor states today, right now. So on a short time horizon, and it's sort of like its goal is, is disruption. China, I think, is operating on it's a rising power with a lot to lose from, exposure in some of these activities. And so at least until recently, it's been, at least on the information manipulation front, somewhat sensitive to attribution, although I think there's evidence that's changing in the context of the coronavirus. It's playing a long game. And, it's seeking a world that I would argue is sort of safe for its interests, and safe for, if not converted to, its worldview. So it prefers a more stable order. It's a different long game. So I think that sort of it's important to bear that in mind, because that has ramifications and implications for how both of these countries carry out their activities.
A question that I have to follow up on this. Are countries such as China and Russia, how much are they copying each other's tactics? And then how deliberately are they exporting some of their tactics and technologies to other countries? Or is it just a matter of economics and trade, basically? Is there a clear plan, for example, for China, who's, involved a lot in Sub-Saharan Africa, to, export some of these technologies? Is it just economics, or are we seeing, are they encouraging some kind of surveillance as well?
Well, on that second question, I think the causes are enormously complex, and Steve has a lot of thoughts about this, so he should come in on this question. But I think they vary from the conditions in sort of recipient states that make this technology attractive. I think, China has certain market incentives, and then it has geopolitical goals. I think that, as I said, China in particular is sort of trying to make the world safe for its worldview, which doesn't mean that it can export authoritarian norms and the technologies that I think provide sort of pathways to really sort of hardening those norms without sort of promoting a coherent sort of alternative model. So I think that that's just one important thing to note. On this question of how much are they learning from each other? How much are they adopting each other's tactics? How much are they sort of deliberately cooperating? I think there's quite a bit of evidence that Russia or that China is adopting some of, Russia's information manipulation playbook. I'm thinking about the coordinated use of multiple conflicting conspiracy theories to cast doubt on official versions of, highly politicized events. So, for example, the origins of the coronavirus crisis, right? An issue that's really of a high degree of salience to to the Chinese Communist Party and to its interests. The use of whataboutism techniques to kind of draw false equivalences and paint the United States as hypocritical, particularly on issues of race and the treatment of protesters. So, after, Black Lives Matter protests, for example, we saw, Chinese diplomats hammering, really trolling U.S. diplomats on these issues and trying to kind of, suggest that the U.S. Treatment of protesters is equivalent, sort of drawing some lines to, in comparison to what was happening in Hong Kong at the time. So those are a couple of ways that sort of China's been adopting Russia's more assertive information tactics. But I think it's also really important to note that China's because it's differently positioned, has really taken on, sort of several techniques of its own. And I think those have gotten a little bit lost in the conversation. So at least one of those is, manufacturing the appearance of popular consensus, right? China uses what appear to be, false personas, right? These are handles that are numbers, or they kind of follow the same pattern, created around the same time. They use these false personas to really inflate the perception of popular backing for pro-China positions. And this is, I think, emphasizes the challenges of creating an echo chamber of support for its views on a platform that it bans at home. And also reflects China's interest in presenting its model. Russian state media, Russia doesn't talk about Russia. It's not about presenting Russia in a positive light. It cares about denting the appeal of Western democracies, China really does want to burnish its image and sort of dampen criticism of its human rights record. And so it uses false personas to do that. Russia does not engage with false personas in that way. And there are other techniques as well, like co-opting hashtags that might be like around issues like Xinjiang, where there are critical conversations happening about China's rights record, among other tactics. But those are just a few.
Just a quick reflection on what's going on in the MENA region, and specifically among the Gulf states, since we are talking a lot about the influence of the regional affairs in adopting certain tactics. For instance, when we see like there is one state in the Gulf started being like signing contracts or having the services of NSO, like UAE, we can see like the other alliance countries will adopt similar technologies and start targeting dissidents using this technology. And now, if you want to just follow the map of all of these tactics, you can find like there's a lot of commonalities among them. One state will influence the other states if they are in the same spectrum of alliance. So when UAE, for instance, will start creating similar to the adopting and somehow the China Great Firewall, the other alliance states in the region like Bahrain and the Saudi Arabia will start adopting similar tactics. And also now, if after all of these scandals of NSO, if one of these states will start considering another supplier or another vendor, we will have like by default the assumption that, okay, other states are gonna follow these steps. So this is in somehow, and talking about the influence of Russia and China, there's a lot in the MENA region, there's a lot of proxy crisis, and now you can see like there is certain states who are not in the spectrum of the alliance of states who can access the more sophisticated technology, while they have access and support by Russia, China, and Iran to carry the repressive operations. So yeah, and somehow it's about how to adapt to new tactics and learn new methods from each other. They are teaching each other, they are supporting each other. But on the other hand, it's somehow about how to access the technology. But yeah, again, there is some kind of regional influence.
Stephen, perhaps from you as well, is there something, or Yinka, something deliberate about some of for example, China's policies? If you look, for example, if China sells a technology to let's say Uganda, or is it in the fine print? So this is also how you can use it, to crack down on civil rights. Obviously, it's not going to be that explicit, but why do these governments then also in Southern Africa accept to use them?
I was going to say that you can sell anyone, any government or any person a tool, and it ends up being, the question is how do they use it? Because many of these tools are not explicitly designed to be used in a negative fashion, right? But the issue always is that if a government, as Steve pointed out earlier about that correlation between authoritarian governments and some of these tactics, inevitably, if you are a government that is concerned about, if you believe that you should remain in power since 1986, like President Museveni in Uganda, inevitably, when you buy a technology that China, for example, has supported many countries in Africa, not just Uganda, many countries in Africa, in building out their 4G networks and help them expand internet access and all the rest of it. But of course, when those deals or arrangements are being made, they can also sell them technologies that can be used to make sure that that the government can keep track of what's going on in their country. Sometimes they're built into the systems, or maybe they're add-ons. It really depends. And what's interesting is that it's obviously not just China. Nura just mentioned NSO from Israel, but also there's a company called Lot from Israel as well, which sold technology to the Tanzanian government, where they used it to sort of filter, social media platforms from being able to be used during the elections and soon after. So it really is. It really is about the government in power and what they're trying to achieve, and because some of this stuff is perfectly fine technology. It just depends on how they use it, and I'm not sure that I'm not sure that the seller can necessarily demand that they only be used a certain way. But even if they did, the argument has always been, particularly with the Chinese, that they are not concerned. They mind their own business, so to speak. Is the way they would frame it.
Just to sort of add on to what's been said, and I agree with all of these different perspectives. I mean, I think it's first of all, it's a complicated issue, and it's by nature, it's very opaque, and it really kind of depends in part upon which country and what kind of relationship they have with China in terms of how these tools are then subsequently used and carried out in different ways. I think in some places it's much more economic opportunism on the part of the Chinese, and a sort of political need by the recipient government that kind of dictates what tools are then deployed and in what form. I think in other situations, and I think Uganda was interesting, where there's actually been direct reporting where you've seen Huawei consultants and technicians directly working with government authorities to arrest certain opposition leaders. There you see much more of a linkage between the Chinese operators on the ground, the government repressive objectives, and how those two can come together in very explicit ways. I think ultimately how I think about it is kind of a push-pull dynamic, which is something that Sheena Greetens and others have written about, which is that you have a push to some degree. Sometimes it's subsidized by the Chinese when it comes to providing different types of surveillance equipment, let's say. You also have a corresponding pull dynamic when it comes from particular countries and their own repressive agendas that they have that they want to carry out. Now, it's not oftentimes, especially when it comes to this pull dynamic, it's not just something that relates to only Chinese technology. Israeli technology from European countries and from the United States are also very much involved in this ecosystem as well. So it is pretty complicated, and I think it extends beyond just a simple kind of Chinese exporting repressive tools, therefore they get used to repress individuals. I think there is more nuances at play when it comes to how this manifests itself.
Nura, I know the Citizen Lab looked quite extensively at the NSO Pegasus surveillance kind of scandal and tools. How much does this, in this instance, how much does it tell us about how widespread digital authoritarianism and its tactics are around the globe, and how much is digital authoritarianism shifting the global power balance between democracies and autocracies?
Yeah, the first thing come to mind now, just like democracy is definitely under attack. And here, I guess I have three dimensions in mind. First of all, like democracies have been under attacks in the modern arena since there were democratic changes attempts and they were cracked down using while autocrats around the world were taking advantage of the technology supplied to them through companies based in the West liberal democracy. Secondly, definitely a decade ago or more, all of these debates around the hope around the internet and social media and bringing democracy to countries under authoritarian system, whereas the few voices were raising alerts around how the authoritarian regimes are taking advantage of all of these democratization tools were not being heard until it's too late. And until now, the world is struggling how to regulate the social media and the cybersphere, and how to prevent the narrative manipulation, how to combat the disinformation. We need to keep in mind that all the time, unfortunately, the global authoritarian regime are taking advantage of the democratization tools, and definitely democracy is under attack. And third, this is a very painful fact that years ago, when the very first reports about the authoritarian regimes targeting digitally the exiled activists, what Marcus Michelson called first digital authoritarian, digital transnational repression, Unfortunately, democracies failed the dissidents. They failed people who are on their soil, who are immigrants, refugees, or citizens, and who are supposed to be protected under the jurisdictions of these countries, while they were targeted by the authoritarian regimes using the most sophisticated digital tools. And yeah, as Yang said, it's not only about NSO, it's about many vendors around the world who are running to sell all of these sophisticated technologies to the authoritarian regimes. And yeah, unfortunately, no action was taken to stop and prevent these threats. Targeting one single person means like targeting and revealing the entire community around this person. Might be anyone sitting between us now and their device being compromised. So all of our discussions and all of these, any kind of information would be like exposed again to these authoritarian regimes. Yet we found like these tools used not only to target activists and dissidents domestically and abroad, and this kind of silence led until like recent scandals about NSO and the heads of democratic countries were targeted using the same technology used for decades, to target the dissidents, like the attempt or the leak and the reports about targeting President Macron. So yeah, it's weaponizing and the digital sphere. It's giving a lot of advantage to autocrats to attack and authoritarian regimes to attack democratic countries, people who are aiming to make change, whether they are their own citizens who live domestically or who are beyond the borders. And no one knows what's coming next.
Question coming in the chat that we also wanted to, that we agreed to talk about today. What should governments and tech companies do to prevent the export of dual-use technologies, for example? And we know a lot of these technologies are actually being manufactured in the West and sold by Western governments. What should governments do to prevent the use of these technologies by authoritarian governments? And the sale, obviously.
Happy to come in on this. I mean, obviously, I think, Western governments need to place limits on the sale of technology that enables surveillance or the interception of communications. I also think it's incumbent on governments to think broader. And this is like a very strong argument for the adoption of updated legal frameworks for data privacy and data protection. So, governments can place limits on the types of information that companies, can collect, and then require them to disclose what they plan to do with that information and what third parties will have access to that information, and what those third parties will be able to do, because that is, I think, an important and maybe sometimes overlooked piece of this puzzle. And then, what can companies do? I think it's everything from, resisting the urge to comply with shutdown orders. I think is incumbent upon companies to provide, real transparency, meaningful transparency around, the kinds of requests that it receives from governments that are understood to be less than wholly free, in particular, but I guess not solely. And then I would just say, like, for platforms, one thing platforms could do is really provide greater transparency around their content moderation decisions. I think it would be useful for platforms to really provide clear and, like, in one place, comprehensive information about how they're making these decisions, and sort of provide processes for appeal, because we know that content moderation can be a tool that governments use to repress speech. So those are some of my thoughts, but I think others probably have many more.
Yeah, no, a couple ideas. So, one, I think companies have obligations that many don't adhere to when it comes to the UN guiding principles, which lays out pretty comprehensively, the type of due diligence requirements that are necessary ahead of time when determining whether there's a possibility of maluse of their equipment, as well as kind of ongoing monitoring and the ability to kind of claw back the use of these technologies when there's documented evidence that they're being used in abusive ways. And so, often when groups like NSO Group, firms along those lines that provide spyware, when they justify these sales and say either A, it's out of our hands, or B, we didn't know about it, that flies against the evidence and what is already inscribed upon legal standards in terms of their own obligations. So I think certainly companies and governments can push companies to do more in accordance to an agreed upon set of principles that most at least pay lip service to. I think a second issue, which is more complicated, especially for companies, is this notion of hostage taking, where a lot of governments are passing, local representative requirements and are directly threatening companies that don't adhere, especially when it comes to taking down certain types of content or leaving up other types of content. They threaten them with getting booted out of the country or completely losing their market share. And so we saw this recently happen when it came to the Russian government pressuring Google and Apple to kick out of their app store a voting app by Navalny that was being used to sort of help Russian citizens make voting choices in the most recent Duma elections. And there, what's come out in reporting is that the Russian government threatened criminal prosecution of Google and Apple employees in country if they didn't comply. And so you see where there is also this sort of limitation where companies feel increasingly in certain markets that they have less and fewer options in which to push back. And so that's where I think it becomes really important for democratic governments to stand behind some of these companies that are facing these types of authoritarian pressures and say, there will be a corresponding price to pay every time a Turkey or a Russia or a Uganda or Nigeria puts in place these types of pressure tactics against platforms that are intended to suppress voices and use very illegitimate tools as a means to do so.
Yinka, do you want to add anything?
To be honest, I don't have a strong view, but I have an almost a flippant question, which is just about what has happened before, what's the precedent here, and I'm comparing this in my mind when I think about selling tools. I think about arms sales. Like, what are the rules with arms sales, right? Can you? There are all sorts of rules in place for the United States, for example, selling weapons to countries in Africa and the Middle East. What are the? Should we have those types of rules where they make sense when it comes to digital technology? Can there be some sort of UN style type agreement on what should be allowed and not allowed, or does it have to? And I'd be interested in what the other panelists think. Really, like, would it have to just be company by company, country by country, or is there something? Are there some sort of broad set of rules and agreements that can be drawn up on the way these technologies, these types of technologies in certain categories can be used? Because as I said before, as other speakers have said, once you sell something to someone, there's no sort of you have no control over how they choose to use it. So the question then is, should they be allowed to sell to them in the first place if they are, say, an American company or an Israeli company or whoever?
Yeah, the question is obviously, do we need to reinvent the wheel and find something new, or are there pre-existing laws, international laws that we can use, especially in terms of due diligence? But also another question that I wanted to address that's in the chat is social media companies recently helped Afghan human rights activists and journalists protect their accounts for fear of persecution. So what do you think, what lessons can be drawn from this, that, you know, sometimes social media companies, when they have the will, they find ways to do it? Or is it, you know, do they just select which ones they want to tackle? First, Noura, you want to say something on this, since you perhaps observe the region a bit more?
I agree with all what the other great panelists have been referring to and raising some recommendations. Also, I guess since we already have the guiding principles, we need probably to push and advocate more towards having a practical framework, some monitoring mechanisms, and some accountable, like some tools and mechanisms of accountability. I always advocate, like, without accountability, we will never have the chance to push the companies and people who might think they can have immunity with the thing that they are doing. Without accountability, we'll never have a better place for all of us. Talking about social media companies, I guess there's a lot of debates about what can be done and specifically to protect the activists and human rights defenders who are at risk. The thing that they did with the Afghan activists, it's great, but also, as you said, it's really the question, is it when they have the will? And is it applicable to all activists under risk, or it's an elective? What are the boundaries here? While until now, for instance, I always feel like heartbroken whenever I think about Abdurrahman Sadhan, who was the human rights activist, was tweeting anonymously from Saudi Arabia, whereas Saudi Arabia had 2 spies working for the government in Twitter. And these 2 spies now are enjoying they fled. They are in the Saudi Arabia, they are running their own businesses, while Abdurrahman Sadhan is still behind the bars. What kind, and this is the question for all social media companies, what kind of measures and policies that they developed since then, not only just reporting to the FBI and having all of these 2 bad actors on the list of people who are wanted, but how they can control that, and how in the first place people in the MENA region, for instance, will feel safe with their data might be accessible through the MENA region hub in the UAE. What kind of policies and measures would be taken by social media companies to prevent the human breach of such data? And yeah, we can spend days talking about the automation and how to respond to the other attempts of manipulating social media, the narrative over social media, and so on. But yeah, since we refer to the Afghan activist with the serious risk, so it's also about what kind of risk might the activists have been facing through the leaks. Like what happened to Abdurrahman Sadhan, and absolutely for what happened to others, we are not lucky enough to hear about them because for many reasons, because even themselves, they didn't know about that, just found themselves behind the bars.
Also, I want to address a question here now that we're talking about civil society groups and what can be done. Beatrice Legrand in the chat asked, Pegasus and other stories reached a wide range of the public through media coverage to denounce digital surveillance. How can we build public protests to push for more political action? And that's also a question that I wanted to raise is, what is the role of civil society groups and journalists in debates over not only regulations, but how can they also play a role in this debate and actions against, you know, the use of these technologies to commit human rights abuses?
Yeah, this is for journalists, and I'll try and tag on the journalist part of the question. For journalists, this is, like I said earlier, this is an incredibly important topic, that because it is the story we're telling, but we're also part of the story because journalists, like activists, are some of the primary targets of some of this digital surveillance. We definitely, I mean, from a storytelling point of view, the thing I have tried to do mostly is to make sure we prioritize these stories, that we raise awareness of what's going on and move beyond, because a lot of the coverage of what's been happening is kind of focused on sort of the bigger companies, you know, your Facebooks and what have you, and rightly so. But mostly because they're big companies. But what we need more of, as well as talking about the big companies, is just really raising awareness of this as a broader issue, because it's not going away. We're going to see a lot more of it coming down on activism, particularly in non-democratic countries, but also for journalists as well, who for years, for decades, journalists have always been under the spotlight. But these new technologies just make it easier to repress other actors against regimes as well.
Yeah, I guess I would just say, echo what you guys just said, and note that journalists obviously play an incredibly important role in speaking truth to power and in keeping citizens informed. And I think one of the ways that we know about the widespread use of unaccountable surveillance technology and the crisis that it's creating for human rights is because of organizations like NORA's, who do incredibly powerful investigations, and they work with journalists to get that information out to the public. And so the first step, I think, toward building a movement for change is building widespread public awareness, of what's underway. And I would just also foot stomp what Yinka said about, the targeting, the deliberate targeting of journalists and activists because of the role that they play or can play in pushing back on these activities. And, I just think one thing to bear in mind is, like, one of the ways that Russia's sort of playbook is evolving and maturing is to increasingly try to, sort of use or like paint its activities as the authentic advocacy of like local, domestic activists and journalists. And that's partly to evade detection, and it's partly because of all of the very complicated dynamics that raises for platforms and for governments who try to push back. So, I think this is sort of a protected class that's doing incredibly important work. And as a researcher, I guess I would be remiss not to say that I think, the research that's done on this space, I think is incredibly important in building a movement for change.
Steve, I know you've looked at different regions in your research. What kind of civil society movements have you seen that are pushing back?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think just as we've talked a lot about the downsides of technology and the way that governments are exploiting these tools for new surveillance methods and so on, I mean, I think the flip side is that there really is a lot of vibrancy that has been unleashed as a result of being able to mobilize, gather together online, and to report on news in different ways. And a couple, things that came to my mind, is first of all, I mean, it's a number of the outlets, such as Yinka's, the rest of the world, which I regularly access and read, and I get sort of new insights that I never would have been able to access, I think, even a decade ago. I think speaks to the ability of broadening the network out to areas that have been underserved, that have not had the same level of reporting. I mean, this is kind of what we're seeing. This is what's new. And so rather than just speculate about what the effect of certain types of technology are, in countries that have gotten less attention, we now have ways to actually obtain and see this information in new dimensions. I think another aspect too that's really interesting is that there has been kind of this shift beyond just formal journalism, investigative journalism, as a way to understand and piece together accountability for actions taken by governments. And so I think about citizen activists, citizen journalist outfits like Bellingcat, which have really pioneered the use of open source intelligence that have been able to work through citizen sleuthing and reliance on different social networks. They've been able to unearth some pretty damning and abusive actions taken by governments like Russia's when it comes to the Skripal poisonings or the downing of the Malaysian Airlines. They've been able to use this information online in new and unique ways to provide much more truth and much more reporting out there for issues that otherwise would have just been opaque and behind a wall. And so in that extent, I think we are seeing kind of this opening up in bigger dimensions around the world and in different regions when it comes to reporting on issues and ultimately holding governments to greater accountability standards, because they know they can't hide to the degree that maybe they could in the past.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Once again, I want to thank you and thank the U.S. Embassy in Ottawa for their support, as well as my colleagues Callum Matthews and Lawrence Salim. The next event in this series is going to take place on the 18th of November. So if you want to sign up, you can go on our website and sign up for a newsletter, or and you'll be informed about how to register. Jessica, Noura, Yinka, Steve, thank you so much. We'll be in touch, because Migs is going to continue its work on this important subject. We also want to look at how next generation technologies will be used by digital authoritarians. So thank you so much, and thank you to our audience for joining us today.